Right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. So really glad to see you here tonight. We have a wonderful presentation for you. I'm Cindy Peister with Unitarian Universalists for Just Economic Community. And Just Economic Community, you have to know that we have been supporting labor for years. And so I was really thrilled when I found out that Steve Morse from Veterans for Peace, Climate Crisis, and Militarism Project was going to work together to found labor, Veterans and Labor for Sensible Priorities. And so he and his wonderful cohort are going to join us tonight. And John Braxton, I'm going to introduce you first, and then Steve, and then we'll go ahead and we'll start our show. John, I was just really impressed that in 2010 you were awarded an honorary doctorate degree from Swarthmore for a lifelong commitment to peace, justice, and environmental sustainability. Because one thing is, we just started this new task force, which is peace, equity, and climate. And it just, we're so glad to have you here. Our interests are very well aligned. And then, John, you first got excited and involved in supporting the peace cause when you were delivering medical supplies to North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. I can only imagine how that must have been for you. And seeing that bombing, you became a draft resistor. And you and Steve both have done serious jail time out of conscience. So you spent 16 and a half months in federal prison for refusing to cooperate with the conscription system. And that was such a trying time. I remember those years very, very well. And then after prison, you were interested in environmental movement and earned a master's degree in ecology. So then you and now Steve have gotten together now and done some really wonderful work. You had already founded U.S. Labor Against the War. And Steve, of course, you were co-founder of Veterans for Peace, Climate Crisis, and Militarism Project. So we're just so glad to have you. And then, Steve, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you two, and then we can just begin the talk. And I think, Steve, you said you wanted to start first. But
Yeah.
Steve grew up as a Quaker on a dairy farm in Pennsylvania. He and John both went to Swarthmore College, and I'm imagining that's where you got to know each other. And in '64, you joined Students for Democratic Society and started doing anti-Vietnam work. And you've done so many things. In Cleveland, you're working with SDS, focused on building an interracial movement of the poor. And you had already completed alternative service as a conscientious objector. But instead, Steve chose to enter the Army in 1969 to be a part of a group project organizing resistance within the military. How brave. And then during 2 years in the Army, you acted as your own attorney in public, and as in a well-attended court martial for distributing literature on the base and put on trial. And then you ended up being court-martialed twice. And after the first 4 months, they put you back in Vietnam, and then they didn't want you there either, and they sent you home to be in the stockade. So from there, the GI Rights Hotline. So that's a long introduction, but these guys deserve it. Steve, do you want to just go ahead and start the talk? I think that was your intention, correct?
Yeah, I will. I will just say I worked with Cindy in the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, and she's a stalwart member. She's right now in the middle of her attending her third COP conference as a delegate. The last two virtually, and the first and the other one in Egypt, the one 2 years ago. So she's worked very hard, and it's great to work with her. So.
Steve knows because we did some projects together and they weren't easy, were they, Steve? But we did it.
No, they weren't. Cindy got really lots of endorsements for addressing John Kerry
You
to
know, we
or
didn't say what the name of your talk was: Labor, Veterans, and Militarism Post-Election. We shouldn't have left that out. And
post-election.
I'm just
Okay,
really
okay.
glad you all joined because we
So
have a lot
nine
to share.
okay, 9 days ago, um, you may know there was an election. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Let me go over how we're going to do this. I'm going to talk a little about the election. John's going to then talk about labor and the relationship to militarism. And then I'm going to talk some about the anti-war uh, veteran movement over time, over decades. And then John's going to talk about his work in U.S. labor against the war. And then I'm going to try to tie together some of those things, veterans and labor. And then John will finish off talking about our project, Veterans and Labor for Sensible Priorities, and um, get into a little bit of you know, what you can do and in relation to us or in general. And I think that will segue into the questions because that I'm sure that will be things that people will want to talk about. Um, so yeah, there was an election. I think it's a sobering election for us. I think it requires maintaining our activism, but doing some reckoning and with going maybe deeper than we often do and doing it with humility and uh, pontificating really isn't ever, shouldn't really ever be on the agenda, but it definitely isn't now. Um, one thing the day after the election, I read a report of people canvassing in Pennsylvania. And what they said was when they were in a neighborhood, when they found the house was kind of nice, they figured it was for Harrison Walz. And when the screen door was broken, it was a Trump voter. So think about that a little bit in relation to the New Deal and Democrats from the 30s being, you know, pro-labor, at least much more than Republicans, and what's happened there? That's like it's turned on its head, and surely it has to do with how Harrison Walz lost the election. Um, when Tim Walz was appointed vice president, uh, vice presidential candidate with Kamala Harris, I was hopeful that at least somewhat hopeful that there would be a focus on working class people because um, he's a guy who definitely grew up working class and has stayed. Uh, it's not completely uh, laudatory his record, but a year ago I was in Minneapolis for about 6 months because of family there in the last couple of years, and I saw in 2023 all the legislation they passed, social legislation, really pro-working class legislation. I mean, like they criminalized captive meetings. It not criminalized, a boss who would run a captive meeting. But there were many things they did. It got a little bit of play that free breakfast and lunch, but they didn't. That was very dramatic, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, what they did in Minnesota. And I thought that they might, put that forward, talk about that a lot. This guy, Tim Walz, he doesn't own a house, he doesn't own any stocks. But they didn't make use of that. And so what I don't want to do, I'm going to only do one what if. Okay. Uh, let's say what if the Harris Walz campaign had said, we're not going to take corporate contributions. So I think it might have been a trade-off. I think they would have gotten a lot less money. They would have gotten somewhat more individual donors. They would have gotten a lot. And let's also, they changed their plan. They talked about stopping, even if Biden wouldn't do it, uh, stopping the weapons to Israel as soon as they could, as soon as she could. Um, being strong on climate, um, immigration, not different things, and the economy. The economy is stupid, right? working class jobs, minimum wage, healthcare for all. What if she'd done that? Well, I think it might have been a trade-off. Let's imagine that she lost by the same amount she lost. But what, would it be different? It would be way different because there would be a move, there would have been an election of integrity, there would have been a movement. The candidates would have encouraged that movement to continue. And at the moment, we don't have any of that kind of leadership. Now we have our groups and we have each other, and that's good. But it would be a lot different. So just some of the things that happened in the Arab American vote in Michigan, 53% of Muslim Americans voted for Jill Stein, about 20 or 21% each for Harris and Trump, all because of Gaza policy and putting billionaires in there. It doesn't work. I mean, some of those billionaires may not really be that favorable to a Democratic victory. Some of them are playing both things, but they want to water down the campaign. So I want to say a little bit about, um, well, there's Project 2025. We may talk about that a little later, but the union Unite Here. Now, hotel workers. Um, so Monday, we had a great action in San Francisco, and we went on the way to the two senators' offices in San Francisco, and we ended up in Alex Padilla's office in front of his building. Um, and, about 500 people, no weapons to Gaza, stop, what's coming up in the Senate, what Bernie Sanders introduced. And really, really a nice militant, but people were really positive with each other. And on the way, we stopped at the Sheraton Palace Hotel, or the Palace Hotel, it's called now, and they're on strike. They had a very spirited picket line. They um, we joined with them, and part of our group was labor. It was faith, the communities, um, immigrant rights, labor, and veterans, and we were just completely in sync. They were chanting, and we were doing that too. Um, this was actually the site of the biggest civil rights action in San Francisco history in 1964, where they integrated the ended discrimination in the hotel industry um, successfully. Another thing about Unite Here is that they've had a ground game for the election, which was very successful in electing Biden 4 years ago, where they got knocked on 3 million doors, 4 million doors this time, talked with 500,000 people. But we didn't see anything. I get messages from the Harris campaign. They just keep pointing money, but they don't say anything about any thanks for these people doing that because their campaign message wasn't a working class message. So it seems like they're not going to say anything about that. And surely Kamala Harris could have created videos of canvassing with Unite Here members or Sean Fain or things like that, but that didn't happen. So I'm going to pass it to John, and go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks, Steve. Um, what I want to do is take maybe 10 minutes. I hope I can do it in 10 minutes or less. And just looking back at the history of U.S. labor with respect to militarism, with respect to the peace movement. And I can share my screen and see whether you can see this. Let's see. Are you seeing my screen now well enough?
No.
Not yet. Not yet.
No.
Let's see. About now.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So some of this I know will be old hat to some people, but I didn't want to assume what people knew about the U.S. labor movement. So back in the 30s, there were two wings to the U.S. labor movement. To some extent, there still are. But back then, there were two. Well, the original organization was the American Federation of Labor, and it was craft unions, mostly skilled workers, almost entirely white workers, and was somewhat conservative politically, except on issues about organizing skilled white workers. And in the 30s, then the CIO formed, the Congress of Industrial Organization. And the difference there was that they were organizing all the workers in an industry. So, for example, prior to that, if you had gone into one of Henry Ford's factories in 1920, you would see the electricians in that plant be in the electrical workers union, and you'd see the people who were making fenders might be in a sheet metal workers union, and you might see the people who were putting tires on be in the rubber workers union, and so forth. And so the CIO brought all those people together under one union within big organizations like the auto industry. And that meant that it was also much more inclusive racially. We don't have time to go into the places where it wasn't. It's certainly not an unblemished history, but it was somewhat more progressive. Um, but focusing now on foreign policy, in the 1940s, as the Cold War was starting to begin, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, created this group called the Free Trade Union Committee. And basically, their job was to create divisions between so-called communist and non-communist unions in Western Europe. And it was funded by the CIA, coordinated by the State Department. And the idea was to identify pro-capitalist unions in Europe. And eventually this spread into Asia. And so why did this come about? Well, I think a chunk of it came because during the war, most of the unions agreed to a no strike pledge during the war. Roosevelt was very concerned about, ramping up the fight against fascism. And so they pledged to not fight. But the government then cooperated somewhat with the formation of unions and with wage increases. And so by doing this no strike pledge, they got some government support for the unions. And then in 1955, the two wings merged and formed the AFL-CIO. But it retained the conservative Cold War policies. So it was almost like they signed a contract. I don't think they actually signed a contract, but it was almost as if they signed a deal that said, okay, we in labor will support your foreign policies if you will go along with us on our needs domestically. And eventually this, in the outline here, I say led to labor's decline. I think I would modify that. I think I would say it contributed to labor's decline. Eventually, it took a long time for that. The labor movement grew into the 1970s. But in 1947, it was 35% of the workforce, and then it dropped by 1991 to 11%, and it's 10% today. And a lot of that 10% is public sector workers that were not organized originally. So only 6% in the private sector. And so how did this affect the AFL-CIO's international activities? How did that affect the labor movement? Well, for one thing, it just meant that a lot of the AFL-CIO's budget and energy and resources were actually spent on this anti-communist crusade. And by the way, often when that word is used, anti-communist, they weren't very precise about how they defined that. So if there were left-leaning unions, then the AFL-CIO tended to be suspicious of them. And so that meant funds were diverted that could have been used for organizing the unorganized or for pushing for social welfare policies, less military spending, more investment in education, healthcare, infrastructure. By 1966, more than one-fifth of the AFL-CIO's budget was being spent on these foreign programs. Um, and so if we start getting up into the 1970s, then of course we know that manufacturing was starting to move into non-union areas in southern US, then into Latin America, the Caribbean, and eventually into Asia. And the AFL-CIO really did not have a coherent program to fight this, in my view. And perhaps people here will have some disagreements with my view. That's okay. We can talk about that. But they did promote buying American and looking for the union label. But again, a lot of their energy was focused on how to fight communist or left-wing movements overseas. And that meant opposition to anything that was left of center overseas, which often meant the most class-conscious organizing unions around the world that were trying to fight for some kind of economic independence in what some people call the global South. I'm not terribly fond of that term, but a lot of people know what it means, so it can have some usefulness. Um, and and so a lot of these unions were actually trying to challenge the power of multinational, transnational corporations. But those unions were weakened as a result of the AFL-CIO's activity, again funded by the US government. And so supposedly working in the name of, quote, free trade unionism, they were actually creating unions that were often very much controlled by authoritarian governments, by dictatorships. And so that weakened these labor unions overseas. And of course, what that means is that the price of labor overseas is low, which facilitates then the offshoring of US jobs to places with weak labor movements and enhance what some people have called the race to the bottom. The head of GE at one point famously said, I'd like to be able to put all the factories on a barge and ship them to wherever the labor cost is lowest. And that's close to what they did. So in that sense, the AFL-CIO leaders really shot themselves in the foot that these so-called free trade agreements caused more US job losses, harming workers around the world, and then ultimately harming workers in the US as well. And so some specific examples of this. Guatemala, 1954, a democratically elected leader, Arbenz, was overthrown with AFL-CIO's support. And the result was a dictatorship that immediately canceled the recognition of over 500 labor unions, interrogating, imprisoning, executing, and, quote, disappeared thousands of Guatemalans. And this led to a 35-year civil war that killed 200,000 civilians. I'm going to share a lot of bad news here. I hope you can hang in there with me because hopefully we're going to get to something about what we can do about this. Guyana, 1964, the AFL-CIO uses $1 million from the CIA to foment a general strike. Often we think of general strikes as being progressive, but this was a strike against the democratically elected socialist Chetty Jagan and forced him out of office. Chile, Chile has its own 9/11. 9/11, 1971 was the overthrow of Allende's. And again, we have a democratically elected leader. And again, the AFL-CIO sponsored strikes in the copper mining and trucking industries. And that strike then became a pretext for the military coup, which led to the Pinochet dictatorship, which lasted for 17 years, killed maybe 3,000 people, tortured tens of thousands. Don't worry, I'm not doing too many more examples of this. I don't want to.
Okay, we can take it.
I don't want to depress you, but these. I think this is very factual. Brazil, another situation where there was an elected leader, And the CIO trained dozens of Brazilian unions in how to fight leftists within their unions. And there was a military coup. Dictatorship then used those trainees to purge Brazilian unions of the leftists. And again, this dictatorship killed and disappeared hundreds of people, detained tens of thousands using torture techniques trained by the US. So again, all this time, the AFL-CIO is really not raising any objection to this, uh, just working lockstep with the Cold War warriors. And and then finally, I think that's finally, yeah, Vietnam. Um, the AFL-CIO not only supported the Vietnam War in words, but actually on the ground, again, they were training unions in Vietnam that were supposedly anti-communist, but uh, that regime was totally propped up by the US government and would never have survived. In fact, the US Eisenhower at one point admitted the reason we stopped the elections that were due to be held in 1956 was because Eisenhower and everybody else recognized that Ho Chi Minh was going to win. He was a communist, but he was also a nationalist and in some sense the George Washington of his people. Um, and and this led famously to the development of a peace movement. And Martin Luther King concluded in the course of this that the US was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Um, so coming back to the labor movement, the cooperation with the US government's anti-communism then actually weakened the labor movement. In 1947, there was a Taft-Hartley Act created that required unions to sign an anti-communist pledge. But this really then led to a purge of anybody that was left of center within the labor movement, within most unions. There were some exceptions to this that survived, but most unions purged anybody to the left of center. And it then strengthened the tendency for the union movement to become bureaucratized and to kind of have the power centered in a labor leadership that was not actually trying to do organizing of the unorganized in a systematic way. And many of those leftists that were purged were the best union leaders around. Uh, in the 1930s, a lot of the union organizing that took place was done by the Communist Party. And I'm not a big fan of the Communist Party. I'm not saying that to suggest that they were, but they were very dedicated organizers and created a lot, including anti-racist organizing. And so what happened was then the climate in the labor movement became such that anybody who might challenge the policies of the leadership had to be afraid of expulsion or even outright physical violence, which definitely happened. So at that point, the AFL-CIO really lost its ability to be the spokesperson, to be the voice for a progressive social movement. It was not speaking for all of the working class. It was speaking for the organized members. And by the way, if you're interested, I can hear some of the sources I used, and I can share them with people later on if you would like me to. The book that has the most depressing title that I know of, but is very valuable on this front, is called Killing Hope. U.S. military and CIA intervention since World War II. And basically, the thesis of the book is that the U.S. opposed any government that was doing anything that didn't match the U.S. model of government and corporate cooperation. So if you wanted to distribute land to the peasants, which Arbenz wanted to do in Guatemala, if you wanted to nationalize the sugar industry, which Chetty Gagan wanted to do in Guyana, if you wanted the profits from the copper industry in Chile to go to the Chilean people, any of those things. None of these people were actually Communist Party people. They were democratic socialists with a Marxist bent for sure. But not, it wasn't as if they were like in lockstep with the Soviet Union. Um, so I think I will stop there and swing it back over to Steve.
Okay. Um, Let me talk a little about the anti-war veterans movement. Um, the veterans movement, the voice of the veterans have been dominated in a certain sense by the VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars, and American Legion, and they've played a reactionary role in many respects. They got a certain trade-off. I mean, the American Legion advocated for the GI Bill in 1944 and got it, and um, that helped particularly white veterans of World War II, not very much to Black veterans. Um, at the end of World War II, there was a veterans group that's not well known called the American Veterans Committee, but it had up to 100,000 people right after the war. It was fully integrated. It was trying to push integration in the racial integration in the US and other progressive policies coming out of an anti-fascist war or wanting to, people were anti-fascist oriented. And there are some people that you may recognize who were in that group: Howard Zinn, William Kunstler, William Sloane Coffin, Medgar Evers, John Huston, the filmmaker, Bill Malden, the cartoonist. So um, there were 100,000 people. It kind of died out after a couple of years. Um, then we have the whole 50s that John's been talking about, the Cold War, the McCarthy era, the purges, and that you weren't able to organize an anti-Cold War veterans group then. The repression was too heavy. And 1954, they changed Armistice Day, which was a day that celebrates the end of war, to Veterans Day, and that not only abandoned an honoring of peace, but it kind of also further weaponized the collective voice of veterans in promotion of war. So um, that changed in the late 60s with Vietnam Veterans Against the War, because people were there for a year, basically. Then there were already veterans who were coming out against the war before many people went in. Like before I went in, I was, aware of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. The name of the organization and just Vietnam veterans who were against the war. There was government repression. I was in that group when I got out of the Army. There was repression, but anti-war veterans have maintained a level of resistance against that narrative, that veterans' interests are, synonymous with promotion of war. So we resist that. Now, Veterans for Peace started in 1985, and it remained a pretty small, white, liberal, middle-class group for quite a few years, from 1985 into the early part of this century. Around 2003, it really grew from about 1,000 people to 5,000 people. It became much more working class. Had really, for the first time, Vietnam veterans. Before that, it was World War II and a certain number of Korean War veterans. And that's continued. It's become more radical. And I mean, yeah, it's a chapter-based group. Our climate group that Cindy and I are in is one of the biggest groups, anti-nuclear. There's a Golden Rule boat that goes around, and we've been supporting war resistors, Israeli war resistors, which is a growing phenomenon now, growing number of people there that are refusing. Russian war resistors, Ukraine as well. So yeah, so we're trying, and I and Art, who's on this call, and John, we're trying to build a labor. We have a labor working group that's kind of getting started. This project we're doing here is part of that. Veterans and Labor for Sensible Priorities. So I'm going to pass it back to John, and I think you're going to talk about U.S. labor against the war, if
Yeah,
I'm not mistaken.
share my screen again. Um, and so in the 1980s, that kind of Cold War consensus, enforced consensus, I would say, within the labor movement started to break up uh, when a lot of people within the AFL-CIO started to question U.S. policy in Central America. Uh, and so the debate started to happen then, but when it really broke open was when George Bush was threatening to invade Iraq. You remember all this weapons of mass destruction and and Saddam Hussein, being responsible for 9/11 and various other myths. And so as Bush was threatening to invade, then just dozens of labor unions started passing resolutions opposing the war. Um, and and a lot of that, I think, was in part because a number of people of my generation, which it looks like a number of people on this call are part of that generation, uh, were people that had been radicalized in the 60s, decided to go into the labor movement. I was one of those for sure, and spent decades working within the labor movement on labor movement issues, but remembered our roots in the peace movement. And so we formed this group called U.S. Labor Against the War, initially as an ad hoc coalition to see if we could prevent the war. And if you remember, there were these massive demonstrations against the war before the war started. And some people referred to this as, a new force for peace. And so this was the first time there was really a national mass-based labor organization opposing a U.S. war. And again, I'm glossing over a lot of details here. There were people in the labor movement all along who were fighting against a militaristic foreign policy, but they weren't able to break into the mainstream part of labor by and large. And so U.S. law worked for over 15 years, grew to more than 170 labor affiliates, including some very large unions, and sponsored contingents in the various peace marches around the country with thousands or even 10,000 labor people participating. And so this was a real breakthrough and was very exciting to those of us that were part of it. And as a result, in 2005, the AFL-CIO convention passed a resolution calling for, quote, rapid withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq and an end to the country's occupation. There was a huge debate about this where some people wanted to say immediate withdrawal, and others wanted to say withdrawal as soon as possible. But how do you define that? So the word rapid withdrawal was agreed upon, with speaker after speaker saying, by rapid withdrawal, I mean now. And then this led to, in 2011, the AFL-CIO Executive Council passing a resolution that declared that American troops must be brought home from Iraq and Afghanistan, and that, I love this phrase here, that the militarization of our foreign policy has proved to be a costly mistake. It's time to invest at home. And then in 2017, the AFL-CIO convention passed a resolution titled "War is not the answer." It said that the eventual cost to taxpayers for the Afghanistan and Iraq wars will top $4 trillion, and talked about the use of military forces around the world has created untold numbers of deaths of civilians and so forth, and pointed out that while the U.S. ranks by far first in military spending, it ranks 7th in literacy, 20th in education, 25th in infrastructure quality, 37th in quality healthcare, and so forth, 31st in life expectancy, 56th in infant mortality. So really raising the question of, what's the effect of having these huge military expenditures? What's the effect at home? Not to minimize the effect that it's having overseas. Um, and then the effect on veterans themselves. Over 39,000 homeless military veterans, um, and uh, and leading to regular, shockingly high amounts of suicides by military veterans and active duty military people. Um, so, therefore, resolved, the AFL-CIO promotes and advocates for a foreign policy based on international solidarity of all workers, mutual respect of all nations, national sovereignty, and calls upon the President and Congress to make war truly the last resort in our country's foreign relations. Uh, we seek peace and reconciliation wherever possible. Bring the war dollars home. And so that's really a 180-degree turnabout. Um, and but unfortunately, U.S. law wasn't really able to continue to have that impact on institutional labor. Uh, at some point, when the Iraq and Afghanistan wars disappeared from the headlines, and unions were having to focus so much on defending their own interests against the corporate attacks, um, that eventually, and the other thing that was happening was that U.S. labor against the war leaders were my generation and older, and we were getting older and not so, we were retiring from our positions within the labor movement. There is, incidentally, another organization that has kind of picked up and modified the name of U.S. Labor Against the War, um, but it doesn't really do what U.S. law did in those days, which was to really try to bring these issues into the labor movement, into mainstream labor. And so um, a few years ago, then, Steve and I and Michael Eisinger, who was the former staff person of U.S. Labor Against the War, formed this group called Veterans and Labor for Sensible Priorities. And our main focus has been on building support for this bill called the People Over the Pentagon Act. The main co-sponsors are Barbara Lee from California and Mark Pocan from Wisconsin, uh, and has about 20 or so other co-sponsors. And it's a very short bill. It says, let's move $100 billion, about 11% of the Pentagon budget, away from military spending and make that money available for healthcare, education, and addressing other human needs, including climate change. So we've been working closely with Veterans for Peace on this, and trying to reach out to unions that were formerly part of U.S. Labor Against the War, although a lot of the leadership has changed since then. And one of the main tools that we use is this pie chart here. I wonder if I can enlarge it. Yeah, make it a little bigger. So hopefully you can see some of this here. The big piece of the pie here is the military. And different organizations attribute different amounts to what goes into that part of the pie. But they all come out with something around 50%, some a little more, some a little less. And so you can see, compared to veterans benefits, it dwarfs it. Compared to education, it dwarfs it. And so we've been going to labor organizations and also to Veterans for Peace chapters and say, will you endorse this bill? And one of the other tools that we have used there, let's see if I can bring it up. Are you seeing this graph now?
Mhm.
Good. I wanted to make sure you're seeing what I'm seeing. So this bar graph shows here's U.S. military spending, and here's the military spending of the next 10 countries combined. So you can see the U.S. military spending is more than the next 10 combined, most of which are U.S. allies. Uh, and if you just look at our so-called adversaries, China and Russia, you can see that our spending is way more than twice the combination of Russia and China combined. So we use that chart a lot in really trying to talk to working class people and say, is this how you want your tax dollars to be used? Or if we just cut it by 11%, $100 billion, just $100 billion, so the military budget is close to 900 billion. We could do all of these things. Tens of thousands of registered nurses, um, 800,000 public housing units, jobs that pay $15 an hour plus benefits, uh, elementary school teachers, clean energy jobs, Head Start slots. All these, notice this is not one of these things or the other. This is all of these things could be done with $100 billion. And part of what is amazing here is that the U.S. government, the Department of Defense has never actually passed an audit. They have failed 6 consecutive audits. So they don't even know where their money's going. They can't even show where it's going. And so we've been pretty successful at getting the labor organizations that are willing to consider this to support this resolution, this bill in Congress. We now have 35 labor organizations signed on to it. It keeps growing. And you can see here's the list of Veterans for Peace chapters all over the country have endorsed this. So I'm going to wrap this up here, but just say this is just a beginning. We know that this bill is not going to pass anytime soon. That's not just because of the most recent election. It would take a major change in consciousness for Congress to recognize this as a priority. But we think that it's worth working on, just like working on things like Medicare for all or raising the minimum wage are things that we need to do, or the Green New Deal are things that we need to hammer away on, even though they're not going to pass right away. Maybe we can get parts of them passed. Maybe we can build consciousness to have this pass eventually. And so we would love it if those of you that are on this call can help spread the word about this. If you have union members in your purview, see if they would be interested in taking this on, and we can help them do that. We can give them a little training about how to go to a union on this, because most unions haven't thought about this before. So I'll stop there, and certainly
Hey,
we're
John,
questions.
let me just take a minute or two and mention the parallels between what's happened with veterans. And you may have noticed this as we're going through this narrative. For example, after World War II, there was left-wing veterans group and left-wing and labor, and then that got smashed. And in the 50s, both groups got a certain payoff as long as they supported the Cold War and, didn't deviate from that. Late 60s, there was revolt against the war. There was a GI movement within the military. There was a lot of labor, early 70s, rank and file. Even in my union, sheet metal union, building trades, pretty conservative. Generally, we had a rank and file revolt there in 1974. So, and then you look at what John's talking about, U.S. labor against the war and VFP, Veterans for Peace, like around 2003, we were both growing like crazy. And yet we were not connected. We were going separately. And so now we want to rectify that problem and work together and with this common ground of working class veterans and working class union members. And also as kind of an analogy for sort of the big tent that we actually need, especially as we face this Trump victory and all that we're going to face there. We need to be united. So it's kind of one example. It's a good thing in itself, but also it's an example of what's needed bigger, I say. So let me stop, and we should do questions or yeah. John, you got any more? We're going to do questions or
Ready to
discussion.
open it up. Yeah, I'd like to hear what
Yeah,
people
so we talked a long time. Sorry.
questions and comments. Yeah.
Yeah.
if nobody else has anything, I'll jump in right away because I was wondering how this interacts or intersects with climate. Anything that either one of you brought up.
Daniel Shea has his hand up.
Good. I'll take a crack at that question, and Steve may want to talk about it too. A lot of people don't know the Pentagon is the largest single institutional emitter of greenhouse gases. Think of all those airplanes flying around the world constantly. And so there really is an important connection there. If we were to cut the Pentagon's greenhouse gases, that would make a significant dent in the world's greenhouse gases. And by the way, one of the strange things in the Paris agreements and the COP agreements has been that the world's militaries don't have to declare the contribution of their military forces to greenhouse gas emissions. So they're hiding all of that from us.
Let me just say one other thing about that. The climate movement has gotten increasingly on board with a question of just transition, that meaning that fossil fuel workers deserve to get union jobs or retraining or early retirement, made whole in some way. So that's become on the table more and more, not so much workers in the war industries. And that's one thing we're trying to bring onto the table, both the fossil fuel workers and workers in the war industries. I mean, in addition, there's the whole global South, there's the, communities that have experienced environmental degradation and things like that. So those things need to be looked at too. But in terms of workers and getting union jobs, getting good paying jobs that are useful jobs, green jobs, think of workers in the war industries as well as fossil fuel industries.
Okay, Daniel, do you want to ask a question?
Well, I wanted to make a little bit of a comment, and because I used to be on the board of Veterans for Peace, I served on it twice, and I am a Vietnam veteran. So I was, actually the first time I even started speaking as a veteran, because I was a labor organizer before, and ended up in a major battle with international non-union, anti-union company that put me out of work. I ended up going back to college in my 40s. And while I was there, George H.W. Bush, he started the first Gulf War in 1991, March of 1991. And January was the January 15th. Iraq was supposed to get out of Kuwait, or they were going to start bombing, and that's what began to happen right off the bat. There was huge demonstrations against the war then. And that's the first time I came out in one of those demonstrations and spoke at an open mic as a anti-war veteran, a Vietnam combat Marine veteran who was opposed to this war, because immediately I saw in my own mind, the blood and death of so many innocent people that was going to happen. And each war that happens after that is the same thing. Now, I'm also an Agent Orange victim, so I'm on the Agent Orange committee with a number of people. I'm also very active locally with labor unions. Right now, partly DSA has been doing a lot of great work in organizing, I was just at a peace mission to the Philippines, organized by a U.S. buy-in Filipino group, and there, all the young people here in Portland that are some of the most active labor activists are within the Filipino group that are here in the United States, and they're with SEIU, they're with a number of different unions, and as a veteran who visits the VA hospital on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, because I have skin cancer from Agent Orange, I've been protesting against the Mission Act, which is trying to privatize the VA healthcare system. So I've been in Washington, D.C., lobbying just before COVID hit. with our SOVA group, which is Save Our VA, which is another campaign with Veterans for Peace. And while we were there, we're dealing with talking to all these different politicians, all had excuses. Yes, we support veterans, but at the same time, they voted, most of them voted for this Mission Act, which is jobbing out and defunding it. And what I really worry about is with Trump in here right now, with the questions of cannibalizing the Veterans Administration, the Medicare, and everything else. This means union wages. This means union pensions. This means health care for everybody in this nation. And unions need to step up and fight to defend these institutions while they exist. We can call on Biden. We have 2 more months of Biden as a lame duck who could do a lot of things if we push him right now to do some executive orders to protect some of these institutions. And we need to push really hard. And we need labor unions and we need social activists. I'm also with Jewish Voice for Peace. That's another organization, and many of our members are labor organizers. So reach out as far as you can. That's what I needed to add. Thanks.
Thank you.
Lucy, aren't you going to ask if they have actions for us to take?
Well, what I'm interested in, and I'm not a vet, I'm a retired minister and interested from the faith perspective. My experience with the peace movement was in the 1980s, early 1980s, when we were trying to keep the nuclear weapons out of Europe. And the organizing was very strong in the Bay Area where I was at the time. And I think it was on the East Coast as well. And it was around affinity groups that would work together. Hundreds of affinity groups in that time working together. And we were standing in front of Livermore labs and getting arrested for blocking traffic and so forth. But what was amazing about it was that the positive movement and the banners that were made and the getting, willingness to get arrested and willingness to be out there. So I'm interested not just in labor and military because I'm not in them, but how the rest of society in different areas like faith can be involved in oddly to say, even a beautiful way when I think of the banners we made, but that it was a positive force for peace. And so, but I don't see that now. I don't see that kind of organizing happening. So if you have any response on that, I'd be interested.
Well, I know the nuclear freeze movement was very successful. I think you were part of that as well, right?
Yeah, I was arrested.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Went to jail.
So I'd say anybody that's on the call that's interested in these kind of things, if you want to leave us your email, we can add you to our future webinars or discussions, because we do have a peace, equity, and climate task force now that really lines very much along these lines, and we would love to see you again. Lorene, I don't know you. I think Mark, I think there's 2 Marks. Daniel, it would be great if any of you would be interested in any way of working with us going forward in peace work or labor work or the climate, all of it, they all intersect.
Yeah, definitely keep in touch with me, okay? This was really a great meeting.
Do we have your contact information?
I think somebody has it.
I know I've got
it might be me.
John or Lorraine.
I've got it somewhere, and
Yeah.
I put Steve and I have each put our contact information into the chat. So feel free to reach out to us. I mean, I think it'd be terrific to see you churches around the country writing to their Congress people and saying, will you become a co-sponsor of this bill? By the way, I wouldn't do it in the next month and a half. I'd wait until it's going to get reintroduced in the new Congress. We're not sure yet who's going to reintroduce it, and it may have a different number. So right now wouldn't be the time to make a big push on this, but we're going to have a call. There's a broader coalition of peace organizations and social justice organizations called the People Over the Pentagon Coalition. There's going to be a call of folks on Monday about that, about what our next steps are. So we'd love to be in touch with anybody who wants to work on that.
I put in the chat labor@veteransforpeace.org. That's a pretty easy one to remember. So you can get in touch with us that way too.
You guys brought up one point that's always been really painful, but a reality that I don't think a lot of people are aware of, and that is when we talk about the suicides. You know, the numbers of suicides from Vietnam War, in my understanding, was possibly even more than those soldiers who were killed during the war, so something like 56,000. And then I have read that the number of suicides post 9/11 wars, so that would be Iraq, Afghanistan, there were 4 times as many veterans that committed suicide than were killed in the war. And so these, you know, I've got goosebumps talking to you. My husband was a Vietnam veteran. When he died, he was still in therapy with the vets, you know, because of the trauma of Vietnam. You know, it was just so horrendous. So, you know, living that life with him, you know, and working also with Veterans for Peace and sharing in the tremendous burdens that many veterans carry with them, to me, it's just so shameful that in this country, we're spending this kind of money to continue wars, possibly a war with China, possibly a war with Russia, definitely supporting a war with Iran, when we can't take care of our people here at home, and when climate is now at 1.5 degrees Celsius every month for the last year, and it makes no sense. So I was very, very grateful when UUJEC decided that it would be okay for us to do a task force on peace, equity, and climate. And any of you that would be interested in joining us in any capacity, it would just be wonderful to have you join us.
And I have a question too. I keep reading that Donald Trump has a strong distaste for war. That he's not a warmonger. He doesn't like war. And I think that, and you know, he's kind of a populist. He picks up on what's going on in the working class. That tells me there's probably a distaste for war in the working class, and much of it. And how are your groups taking advantage of this? There's got to be some way to take advantage of this distaste for war that we're talking about here among the working class that even Trump reflects.
I wanted to say something I think we haven't mentioned tonight is about the National Labor Network for Ceasefire, which there are 7 national unions in that, and there's 7 of the 11 national unions who have made statements for ceasefire in Gaza, and over 200 local unions and other labor groups as well. And it represents a majority of the unionized workers in the U.S. And so I think, and we're trying to contact some of those people over Pentagon. But I think it's in the mainstream press. That's not publicized very much, you know. And even the industries, the unions in the war industries, like the UAW machinists, have made statements have come out for ceasefire as well. So, yes, workers, people don't want to be bombing Palestinians in Gaza and paying all that money and killing people and, you know.
What one of the things that I've learned to say, it wasn't my idea originally, in talking with groups that don't see themselves as traditionally part of a peace movement, is to say, when was the last war that actually solved a problem? And you say, well, was it Vietnam? Well, it's hard to argue that that solved a problem. Was it Afghanistan? That's pretty hard to argue. Iraq, things aren't going so well there. And that, and then couple that with, uh, if you could create a federal budget, what would your priorities be? And if you ask that question and ask people to call out, well, they say things like, well, I'd like to see free public college education. I'd like to see healthcare for all. Very few people say, I want half of my budget to go to the military. So I think you're right that there is an opening in the working class for this kind of conversation.
I think
Robert hasn't said
there's
anything. I just wondered if he might want to say. Never mind. Go ahead. But maybe if Robert wants to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there was they reach out to the students, the student encampments these that opposed war and are really under, many of them have been expelled, they've been arrested. There's court cases coming up, and I think they even professors have been censored. I think we need to defend them with our labor unions, and that brings people into the union, the labor movement, because they see them as defenders of their rights.
I just had a quick question. What was the name of the organization
I'll put
that
it
you
in
were
the chat.
talking about, Steve? Okay, great. Thanks.
So again, if people want to share your contact information in the chat and would like to stay in touch, we'd love to see this spread in ways that we probably haven't thought about yet. We've got enough focusing on the labor movement context that we do have, but there's a lot of labor movement context that we don't have, and a lot of this spreads. The way to spread it is mostly if you have some personal contact with somebody. It doesn't. We don't right now have. It's not sort of in the air where if somebody's people aren't like spontaneously saying, how do we cut the Pentagon budget? But if we go to people that we know and we have a relationship with them and say, hey, we're working on this, and explain why, even though it's not going to pass anytime soon, we think this is worth spending time on. Those personal relationships are what allow these ideas to spread. And hopefully someday it starts spreading like wildfire. Maybe that's a bad thing.
Did we answer Lorraine's question?
Yeah, I got the
okay.
answer. And I just wanted to say, I think it's made me think better about the possibilities. Like we have such a vital ceasefire and coalition in Portland and Oregon, for example, and just using some of that really good information that you shared. Like the budget page was so, I just think it really grounds it could be just a good addition to those conversations. So I look forward to that. And I am very curious about the 7 unions who've signed on and are actually moving something there to sort of think about where to begin to have those conversations in my own area.
By the way, one of those national unions is the American Postal Workers Union, which has a whole lot of veterans in it. But they're one of the national unions that signed on to supporting the people over the Pentagon Act.
I'd like to point out also that these days just supporting the ceasefire isn't good enough. We have to be focused on stopping the funding because there's so much impunity that Netanyahu knows he can get away with anything with impunity unless we actually stop the funding. And we can
Right.
say ceasefire, we can say negotiations, two-state solution is having no effect until we actually pull the plug.
That's what I found so helpful about tonight. So thank you very much. Just to add that information to the conversation.
You know,
Really nice to see Hyro out there. Hyro.
do you know
Go
any
ahead.
Republican in Congress who is for peace, for changing this? Do we know any? Is there any inroad in the Republican Party for this?
I'm not aware of it, but I'd like to believe that that's just because I haven't explored it.
Okay.
Well, I'd say certainly the squad, you know. AOC could be counted on for peace, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
there are a bunch. I mean, all of the 20-some co-sponsors are Democrats.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, I have the list here. There are 24 of them. And yes, they're all Democrats. Sometimes you have some kind of oddball Republicans who are pretty bad on most issues, and Rand Paul or something, or Mike Lee from Utah, and they're pretty bad in general. But every once in a while, they say something against war.
I think that's real important right now with Trump elected and both the House and Senate going Republican. If we can find even a few Republicans to build relationships with, even though we may disagree on the other things, that's a start.
They want to reduce the budget.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, some of them, yeah, don't like spending beyond the budget. I mean, actually, the budget itself is not the real constraining factor. It's inflation. If you spend too much, you cost too much, and we're at that point now where there's not excess capacity in the economy. If you spend more one place, that causes inflation. And we ought to be saying that we're at that point now where we just can't spend more without consequences. So that means we have to cut back on military spending, on luxuries for the rich, and if we want to spend more on things for the people, for example.
Let me just say that in terms of the total military spending, the Pentagon budget was around 900 billion, as John pointed out, but the portion of the national debt that's attributable to wars and militarism, the interest on that is about 400 billion a year. So you really have to add that on. We support veterans' health. We're against privatization of the VA. We support taking care of veterans, but you also really have to consider those expenses as due to militarism, and that's another couple hundred billion. So you're really up to about $1.5 trillion a year when you count all those things, and that really is about equal to the whole rest of the world's expenses on militarism.
Well, Musk wants to cut the budget too. We'll see what he can do. I don't know where he is on the war.
Yeah, well, Musk probably is going to have issues. When you get a bunch of billionaires working with Trump, some of them are going to have egos and it could be trouble. I think they'll be bashing each other before they start bashing us, actually.
That's right.
He wants to spend the money on space, so we could argue that that's better than military.
It
If we
could be.
If we could only just put all those billionaires on a rocket ship and send them up into space.
Absolutely.
Keep it going. Let them explore Mars and
They can take the cash with them. We'll just print up some more.
Yeah,
How much
Without
would
a
it
return
cost?
ticket, right?
yeah, I'm worried we're becoming more like Ukraine, where you can't get involved in politics at all unless you have a billionaire behind you. So this extreme inequality is reducing politics to a battle of the billionaires, just through sheer funding, and that's really really sad. But I think we're seeing that you guys, your movements are really great, but what billionaires do you have behind your movement? None, you see, and so you're totally sidelined.
You
Well,
know, in our last webinar that we had last month with Marcy Winograd, we were talking about space. And here I live on the Central Coast of California. And Elon Musk has already worked a deal with the US military here to have private flights into space from the military base at huge, exorbitant prices. So it's a crossover of commercializing militarism with billionaire class, what do we call them? Space travelers. If you want to know more about that, Braxton, John, it's on our website. We've got a webinar that we did with Marcy last month. But it's just phenomenal. I mean, we're crossing all the lines of any sort of democracy when we bring someone like Elon Musk in, who considers himself really the vice president of the country and is on the calls with foreign policymakers. I mean, that's the direction we're going. And if we look at Project 2025, it's just, we're all going to have our work cut out for us. Let's put it like that.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, Musk has all these satellites up, and he was throwing his weight behind Russia and not the Ukraine, and so he was cutting off communications for the Ukraine to fight the war. And he's a really very powerful man from that respect. You can turn off communications. You're almost godlike.
So I'm going to have to go, but I wanted to say I think there's
Thanks,
something missing. There's something missing from your chart. Can you hear me okay? John,
Yeah.
I think you need to add the budget item for sending billionaires to space.
Oh.
So, okay, just a suggestion.
Hopefully that's not taxpayer
I,
money.
the other thing I saw, well, hell, we might
we
be
could
able to get that one passed.
Shall,
pay for it too, yeah.
shall
But
we
the other
close
thing
up
I was
here?
thinking, you know how they have the like the climate clock or something? I think how cool. I know there's a lot of organizing around climate change that's coming. People are meeting and planning and really thinking now of what to do, and in collaboration with all kind of social justice movements. But having something that would be really kind of iconic but visual to be a part of that organizing, I think would be great. So I don't have that idea tonight, but it's worthy to think about. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks for this opportunity. I really appreciate the chance
Yeah,
to
it's
do
great.
all of this.
Thanks,
That's
John. Thanks, Steve.
Oh, it was
Shall we say
Since
wonderful.
I
goodnight?
invited, since I invited a few people and their hand is raised, I want them to be heard. So Mark Darienzo.
Yeah, Dan Shea put something in the chat, but I'm with Extinction Rebellion, and us and other co-sponsors are sponsoring a film called Outgrow the System, which is really looking at alternative forms of economic systems that are, equitable and favorable to the planet. The planet. It's kind of a visionary documentary about what kind of a vision do we have of the world, and that's going to make it more equitable and more environmentally sustainable. So it's going to be shown tomorrow evening in Portland, but this producer is just trying to distribute it worldwide, and they're Swedish production producers, but it's well worth it because they have the person who wrote Donut Economics there and there. Also, Robin Hannell, but a Portland State University professor, emeritus, is on the film. So it really covers a lot of different types of alternative economic systems and figuring out a way to make the world better. So,
what's the name of it?
outgrow the system. It's in the outgrow the system.
It's in the
Can you
chat.
give us a link?
It's not. Is it going to be available online?
No, it's what you could do is you could what I'll do is I'll try to give you I'll send a trailer to
Okay.
one of you, or I'm on the list now, but I'll send a trailer to one of you whoever wants to get it. I can send a trailer, and then that way you can go from there.
Good.
You can send it to UUJEC at uujec.org, and I will get it.
Okay, so can you put that in the chat? I don't have a pencil.
Yes, I can. Let's see.
Yeah,
I can put it out. I can put it in here. UUJEC.
Good night, all. Good night, Portland crew.
There.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Lorraine.
I think that film needs to be renamed as not outgrow the system, but undergrow the system. We're outgrowing the planet. We're already outgrowing the planet. We need to go backwards.
Well, it has a degrowth framework as well. You know, just
Okay. Right. Right. That's good.
Mark, you know, that is one of our main focuses. You know, this UUJEC is about economics and just economics. So donut economics is something that we talk about in our meetings. Lucy has really been pushing that for a long time. You know, what you're talking about is right up our alley and exactly what we would like to know about and maybe collaborate with you about.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely get some information to you.
I'm in Salem too, so I can connect your Oregon.
Yeah, well, come on up.
I've got to leave too. So,
Is somebody saving the chat?
I can.
Yes,
it'll automatically be downloaded.
There's contact information.
If you'd like it, I'll send it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay.
And is it recorded? Is this recorded?
Yeah. Well, with luck, it says it's recorded.
Okay.
Let's see if I can capture it.
Well, you'll send that out too, right?
I was explaining earlier that it's a new computer, and of course it's a new Zoom program, and things are a little different. So it took me a while to get things up and running.
Can you save the emails who signed in too?
I saved the chat with the emails in it, and I'll send it out to everybody whose email is on it.
I have the registrations for you, Cindy.
Oh, great. Okay, I can send it to you, Terry, and you can send it.
Okay.
And you can send the recording link too, I guess.
Okay, I'll probably send you a link for the
Recording?
YouTube, if that works, as opposed to an MP4.
Yeah.
It's also on our website. It will be on our
Okay.
Okay. Good night.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you.
you.
Much, John. Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks
Bye.
thanks for